Thank you, Stephen. And let me say it's just an immense privilege to be part of this event, which I have enjoyed enormously up to this point. And to be part of something like this that really celebrates, I think, Bob's work and also Bob's personality in a certain sense. Several people have talked about Bob's extraordinary and I think unique, as I put it, seriousness about philosophy that was at the same time a total unpretentiousness about philosophy. And we've all of us experienced this, the sort of completely natural sense that he had that philosophical issues had to be discussed and they were going to be discussed. And he did so very, very vociferously often and insistently, but with this tremendous good humor and without any sort of hint of the kind of aggressivity that sometimes comes with that sort of relentless, that sort of intellectual relentlessness that really characterized him. And I have to say I'm very sad that he isn't here to engage in argument in the way that he would have done. I would have really loved to see what he would have said, partly because the thing that I'd like to talk about was really sparked in a way by arguments that I had with Bob, in particular about the concept of contradiction. But we had quite energetic back and forth on that topic, and that's part of what's really continued to stimulate my interest in what I want to talk about today. And I hope everyone has the handout or has sight of a handout, is able to share it. I've made a handout rather than do a PowerPoint so that you have texts that you can look at sort of whenever you want to as I go. So what I want to do is to make use of a piece by Bob Stern as a way of opening up a very large set of issues that I take to be fundamental to Hegel's philosophical project. And this really is a Hegel talk. And I will do so, open up these questions in a very, very exploratory spirit. And I hope that this event is a sort of suitable occasion for doing something much more exploratory and really, hearing what you have to say than I might otherwise. I realize that these are really immense issues, issues that are challenging in their complexity, since they open up questions whose scale, I think, matches that of Hegel's philosophical project in its entirety. I think it's worthwhile allowing oneself once in a while to stand in awe of just what it would be to comprehend Hegel's philosophy as he carries it out. By that I mean Hegel's philosophy as he does it for us in his systematic works. So the starting point of my talk will be Bob's 2016 article entitled Determination is Negation, The Adventures of a Doctrine from Spinoza to Hegel to the British Idealists. In that paper, Bob's concern is very specific, namely a puzzle about the relationship between Spinoza and Hegel, and the senses in which they can be associated with the slogan omnis determinatio est negatio. So Hegel regarded the slogan omnis determinatio est negatio as, quote, the principle of Spinoza's philosophy, a notion that he had got from F.H. Jacobi's reading of Spinoza. So Spinoza doesn't actually say this anywhere in the Ethics. There's a reference to such a doctrine in a letter where he's actually talking about a geometrical figure. In any case, the puzzle with which Bob was concerned was that Hegel at one and the same time seemed to do two things. So Hegel firstly seemed to attach a very different reading to this doctrine as it appeared in Spinoza from one that he, Hegel himself, could be comfortable with. What Hegel wants to do with the doctrine for his own purposes even seems, as Bob says, to be the opposite of what he understands Spinoza to have meant by it. So very roughly speaking, in Spinoza's hands, it seemed to mean something like that any negation was a privation from true being. whereas in Hegel's hands it means something like all determination is negation, sort of bring it on, as it were, because what we need is precisely to show that the true is in some sense self-determining, and it does so through negation. So that's the first part of the puzzle. First side of the puzzle, there seems to be this opposition between what Hegel thinks Spinoza means by the doctrine and what he himself means by it. And this is the puzzle. Secondly, and in the same breath, Hegel seemed to hail Spinoza's doctrine, even as understood in Spinoza's way, as a great insight on which he then wanted to build. In particular, in a remark that occurs in the Dasein chapter of the Science of Logic. So I'm not going to enter into Bob's discussion of the puzzle. That would take us too deeply into questions about what Spinoza meant and how Hegel understood Spinoza, which are very difficult questions, I think. I am, however, going to make use of Bob's discussion in two ways. So first I'm going to take up, if in a very loose way, Bob's suggestion that the slogan omnis determinatio est negatio can be read as capturing something fundamental to Hegel's philosophy as he presents it to us in the Science of Logic. Namely, for Hegel, speaking very loosely, the true is such as to determine itself, and its determination of itself is marked in some very deep way by negativity. I'll use that suggestion to open up the question of how Hegel gets negation into the picture in the first place. So that's kind of my primary exploratory question: how does Hegel get negation into the picture in the first place? And people might wonder whether that's even the right way to think about what Hegel's doing with negation. Secondly, so this is another way I want to make use of Bob's discussion. I want to exploit a very nice feature of that discussion, which is that it very deftly, and I think in a manner characteristic of Bob, brings in some deeply informed historical scholarship to make a philosophical point. The portion of Bob's vast historical knowledge that he brings in is his detailed understanding of different strands of British idealism. One of these strands, represented by F.H. Bradley, might be called, to use a paradoxical phrase, Parmenidean Hegelianism. For idealists of this type, there is ultimately just the one, with all determination to be understood as ultimately illusory. The other strand, represented by John and Edward Caird, might be called, and I hope Bob would not object to this label, authentic Hegelianism. For these idealists, reality is constitutively determinate. This substantive contrast between Parmenideans and non-Parmenideans is very helpful to me here, because I will want to suggest that a first step in understanding negation is to have overcome the Parmenidean puzzles tackled in Plato's Sophist. So although I'm not going to stake any claim to being able to characterize Spinoza's position accurately, I will stake a claim about what Parmenideanism is. Furthermore, a purely affirmative conception of being, such as that of Parmenides, is arguably precisely what Hegel, in the guise of the beginning of his logic, works to show up as, after all, only having been graspable. That is, this Parmenidean being will be shown up as only having been graspable in the light of the work he will do with negation in the course of the logic that will retroactively constitute pure affirmation as what it is. So the basic plan of the talk is to proceed in 4 stages. So there'll be 4 sections. In section 1, I'll introduce the central importance of negation for Hegel and raise a series of complexities in the area of getting a proper grasp of what he might be up to with negation. As part of this, I'll try to distinguish in a preliminary way between the question of how Hegel gets negation into the picture at all, which is the question I want to focus on, by contrast with the question of how we are to understand the, quote, self-referring negation that comes into its own in some of the most difficult and also important passages of the doctrine of essence. In section 2, I'll reconstruct Plato's solution of the Parmenidean puzzles of not being in Sophist. And this is a very ambitious task, but this is what I'll try and do. I'll try to show that Plato effects the solution by means of an investigation of negation, and specifically of the nature of the contrast between statements of the form blank is blank and blank is not blank. I'll present Plato not as offering a constructive semantics of not, as many interpreters have presented him, but as drawing our attention to the nature of the difference between blank is blank and blank is not blank, as reflective of what G.E.L. Owen called the parity of affirmation and negation. It will turn out that negation is intelligible only if it is recognized as equiprimordial with affirmation. I'll suggest that one way to think of parity is in terms of a two-way power. In section 3, equipped with the insights about parity, I go to Dieter Henrich's account of how Hegel gets negation into the picture. Henrich suggests that what he calls autonomous negation is Hegel's basic operation and can be considered the key to the science of logic. Here matters become very complex because what Henrich is trying to explain is Hegel's distinctive notion of self-referring negation, which is entirely novel and whose relationship to classical propositional negation is a highly vexed question. What I want to suggest is simply that Henrich's reconstruction of the basic operation fails at the first step because it requires something unintelligible. It, that is Henrich's reconstruction, requires us to regard negation, at least at first, as set completely in isolation without any reference to affirmation or indeed to anything else whatsoever. That might just mean, if my objection works, that might just mean that Hegel's self-referring negation cannot be reconstructed in this way. That is, we have to look for some other reconstruction or some other approach than Henrich's. But I think that the unintelligibility of autonomous negation, that is, negation that begins by being just negation on its own, in any case presents an impasse for Hegel to get negation into the picture in the first place, if he thinks, which Hegel may think, that this can be done without at the same time getting affirmation into the picture. So in section 4, the final section, I'll return to Hegel and consider further just why, if what I've said about the equiprimordiality of affirmation and negation is correct, it will be difficult to see whether or not Hegel can agree with this. Okay, so section 1, the centrality of negation in Hegel. One of the difficulties about tackling the topic of negation in Hegel, as I won't need to tell people in this room, is its sheer ubiquity. He speaks of negation on just about every page of the Logic, or mobilizes the notion of negation on just about every page, and prodigiously across his other writings too. It is as omnipresent as, say, freedom or reason. Perhaps even more so, actually. Another issue is that it seems to be inherent in his understanding of negation that it is multiform. It turns out to be operative in many different ways and at many different levels. In his discussion of Egyptian religion, he says that, quote, the negative, this abstract expression, has very many determinations. Another issue is that Hegel equates external negation, which he treats as different from the central notions of negation he's concerned with. He equates external negation with abstraction. And that external negation seems quite clearly to be contrasted in his mind with a negativity that he describes as something like the driver of dialectic. And then there is a whole series of different modulations of the idea of negation: determinate negation, self-referring negation, negation of negation, absolute negation or absolute negativity, which he associates with form. And I'm not going to try to suggest how all these are related to each other. Again, negation operates as a structuring device at all levels of the system. It is there at the level of the smallest transitions, but it is also there, for instance, at the level of the interrelation of the three books of the Logic. Hegel writes in the material that opens the third part of the Logic, where he reflects on what he's just been saying in a preliminary way about the doctrine of the concept to be expounded in that part of the Logic, quote, the foregoing consideration of the concept shows it to be the unity of being and essence. Essence is the first negation of being, which has thereby become illusory being. The concept is the second negation, or the negation of this negation, and is therefore being once more, but being that has been restored as the infinite mediation and negativity of being with itself. Unquote. This presence of negation at all levels can produce a vertiginous effect, one that is in keeping with Hegel's philosophical program, according to which no local zone is immune from being dynamically acted on from those further zones to which it gives way. The signal importance of negation and negativity for Hegel's philosophy can be brought out by considering his association of these notions, negation and negativity, with those of the I, the subject, activity, spirit, and God. In a crucial passage across paragraph 1718 of the preface to the Phenomenology, one of the most famous passages in that preface, Hegel makes this explicit. And so this is on the handout. In paragraph 17, he says, "In my view, which can be justified only by the exposition of the system itself, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true not only as substance but equally as subject." And in light of this crucial bringing in of the subject, he says in the following paragraph, paragraph 18, "This substance is as subject pure simple negativity, and is for this reason the bifurcation of the simple. It is the doubling which sets up opposition, and then again the negation of this indifferent diversity and of its antithesis. Only this self-restoring sameness, or this reflection in otherness within itself, not an original or immediate unity as such, is the true." So insofar as substance is subject, it is pure simple negativity. In another passage in the preface, he speaks of, quote, "the tremendous power of the negative," which he glosses as the energy of thought of the pure I, and he speaks of spirit as tarrying with the negative, a tarrying that is the magical power that converts it into being. These passages might seem to suggest not only the centrality but also the priority of the negative for Hegel, an impression confirmed when Hegel writes in the introduction to the Science of Logic, quote, "That which enables the concept to advance itself is the negative, which it possesses within itself. It is the negative, which constitutes the genuine dialectical element." So what's genuinely dialectical is something's being driven by the negative. It would seem that it is the negative specifically then that drives the dialectic, but it need not be so, I think. He also writes in the same introduction to the Science of Logic, that, quote, "Dialectic as it is here understood is the grasping of opposites in their unity or of the positive in the negative," and he says it is in this that speculative thought consists. There is, of course, a difficulty here in the way I've been treating the expressions negation, negativity, and the negative as belonging together. It might seem that negation is a logical operation, whereas negativity and the negative might have a different character. Hegel, of course, develops his theory of the negative judgment as a bit of traditional logic only in the doctrine of the concept. But this is not decisive, I think, since it is characteristic of Hegel to regard what is later in the logic as doing the work of grounding what is earlier and thereby showing up what is earlier for what it truly is. This is reflected in a passage embedded within the remark in the Dasein chapter, which is the remark in which he talks about Spinoza and omnis determinatio. Quote, "Negation here stands directly opposed to reality. Further on, in the special sphere of reflected determinations, so that is in the doctrine of essence, it becomes opposed to the positive, which is reality reflecting the negation, the reality in which the negative has an illusory being, or scheint, the negative which in reality as such is still hidden." Arguably, negation comes into its own only in the doctrine of the concept, as having the solid articulation of the judgment. But that would tend to confirm rather than challenge the notion that at root it is negation in the logical sense, or in something sufficiently akin to the logical sense that Hegel is concerned with throughout. As I'll return to, the challenge is ultimately what sense can be made of negation and of negative if it were not read in terms of the negating of something akin to the propositional. So by that I mean Hegel in many places speaks of the negative doing its work in a way that suggests that doesn't mention the idea of something's being negated. But the question I want to raise is what sense we could make of that. Hegel certainly comes to distinguish more carefully between otherness and negation in the 1832 edition of the Doctrine of Being compared to the original 1812 edition, as Stephen Houlgate points out in his recent book on the logic of being. But even if Hegel's talk of negation had been more profligate or less constrained in the 1812 version, its continuing crucial role in the 1832 version of the Doctrine of Being means that the question as to its intelligibility, if not in proto-propositional terms, remains. So I now want to turn to Plato's Sophist. This is section 2. This may seem perverse, since Plato's solution of the Parmenidean puzzles about not being in that text counts among the most difficult and controversial passages in Plato, with a seemingly inextricable density and a sense of plumbing philosophical depths that approaches that of Hegel's Science of Logic. Nonetheless, I will try to convince you that good sense can be made of the solution offered in Sophist to these Parmenidean puzzles. The overall aim of the dialogue is to hunt down and trap the Sophist, a project which a philosopher from Elea, the Eleatic stranger, carries out in conjunction with Theaetetus. The Sophist they are attempting to trap is one who trades in illusion, specifically the art of making believable but false statements. To hunt down the Sophist and smoke him from his refuge takes us into the realm of Parmenidean puzzles, because the Sophist relies on the Parmenidean claim that there is no such thing as falsehood, or that it is not possible to say what is not. In Parmenides' case, the notion that there is no such thing as falsehood is generated by the claim as that there is no such thing as what is not. Note that the notions of falsehood and not being here are interdependent. I've put these onto the handout just so that it's maybe easier to look at them. Theaetetus is flying as false, supposing that Theaetetus is doing something more normal, like sitting. In just this same scenario, Theaetetus is not flying is true. And now there's a puzzle here, and it's the same puzzle shared across the version in the first version involving a false affirmation and the second version involving a true negative statement. And the puzzle might be put like this. What makes Theaetetus is flying false? Or alternatively like this, what makes Theaetetus is not flying true? The temptation, natural temptation, is to look to reality, glossed as how things are. But reality, the reality in which, let's say, Theaetetus is sitting, does not contain anything that is specifically Theaetetus is not flying, as opposed to his not running, his not lying, and so on. Wittgenstein raises a similar puzzle. So it's exactly the same puzzle, and I hope it's helpful just to rehearse it as a different version. Suppose it's falsely said King's College is on fire, or it is truly said King's College is not on fire. In either case, there's nothing to point to in reality, which is King's College specifically not being engulfed in flames. To speak loosely, there are indefinitely many things, perhaps, in which King's College is not engulfed. Among, and again, speaking loosely, one could say indefinitely many further absences of various kinds. Now, the Eleatic stranger speaks of himself as committing parricide against Father Parmenides, the great philosophical giant from his hometown. He does so by working up to directly contradicting Parmenides, namely by asserting that we can say what is not. How does the Eleatic stranger solve the puzzles? He does so by focusing on the difference between blank is blank statements and blank is not blank statements. He does not do so by offering constructive semantic analysis of not. Instead, he arrives at the solution by working through the general idea of differences in predication. There is a difference, for example, between blank is large and blank is small. Here the difference is not quite that of a contrary. Strictly speaking, the contrary of blank is large is something like blank is small or medium-sized. Of course, the obvious thing to say is that the contrary of blank is large is blank is not large. And that should capture the medium-sized as well as the small. And it would seem that quite generally, blank is blank differs from blank is not blank by being contraries of each other. Now, the Eleatic stranger's crucial move is to show that this is not right. By the way, I'm just taking the crucial type of statements to think about as being these predications in which there's something that comes after the is or that comes after the is not. Simply because that's what the dialogue principally discusses. So I'm not, I'm abstracting away from further issues about the completeness or incompleteness of the verb to be and different grammatical uses of it in Greek and English. I think we'll find the same way in which the difference between having the not there and not having it will work out, whichever of these usages we actually look at. Consider that blank is beautiful is the contrary of blank is not beautiful, in that assuming the absence of indeterminate or intermediate cases along the lines of blank is meh, where meh things are neither beautiful nor not beautiful, the two carve up reality into the beautiful and the not beautiful things. Now, the Eleatic stranger's insight, I think, is that the case of blank is blank and blank is not like this. It's not like is beautiful and is not beautiful. Because it is not as if there's some region of reality in which the blank is not blank cases are to be found. Just as there's no place in reality in which King's College is not on fire. So the stranger concludes with the help of Theaetetus, the contrast must be of a different order from the contrast between blank is beautiful and blank is not beautiful. So that type of ordinary predication. The crucial move is where the stranger introduces a division within the concept of difference. Edward Lee has shown that this move is of far greater significance than is generally recognized. So the idea is there's one kind of difference between blank is beautiful and blank is not beautiful, and another kind of difference between blank is blank and blank is not blank. The second kind of difference is of a different order in that it does not partition reality. It is, in other words, a syncategorematic, not a categorematic difference. I don't know if that's helpful, but it's just another way of putting it. It is this syncategorematic difference that underlies Aristotle's contradictory pair. This may seem paradoxical relative to the stranger's insistence that he's been able to trounce Parmenides' prohibition on statements to the effect that not being is. The stranger almost makes it sound as if not being, that is, that which blank is not blank brings into the discourse, has its place in reality, by saying that we can, after all, say what is not. But precisely not. Statements about what is not, such as Theaetetus is not flying, are true, not because Theaetetus' not flight can be accommodated within reality, but because of a fundamental difference that lies deeper than the partitioning of what succeeds in showing up in reality. Instead, the stranger says, quote, that which is not really is just this, namely that each part of the nature of the different that's set over against, namely each part of the nature of the different that's set over against that which is. This the stranger seems to think of as being, though deeply veiled at first, something that can show up as evident from inside our discourse if we pause to think about it. Comparably, Wittgenstein calls a similar insight in the Philosophical Investigations a truism. What the stranger effectively shows us is that our ability to say blank is blank and to say blank is not blank is a two-way capacity. He brings this out repeatedly by saying that there is just as much confusion about that which is as there is about that which is not. There's just as much confusion about that which is as there is about that which is not. In fact, one might say language is deceptive here. We're not aware that there is just as much of a problem about blank is blank as there is about blank is not blank. Because it looks like in the case of blank is blank, there is just an absence where the not is in blank is not blank. Looks like there's just something not there. The contrast is not, so the contrast that we make in language is not that between something that would be perhaps more useful in this light, like, I don't know, if we said something like blank is yes blank, and blank is not blank, which would more properly reflect the two-wayness of our capacity to determine the world in discourse. Connected to this, note that there is really no positive counterpart in language for negation. So recall that affirmation has for its proper contrary denial and not negation. So I'll loosely talk from here on about negation and affirmation, but by affirmation I mean that thing that's there in the blank is blank, but that's hidden by the absence, where one might want something that would correspond to the not in the contrasting case. So I think that for the stranger, the two-wayness of the capacity means that blank is blank and blank is not blank, or as I'll now call them in a now self-consciously misleading way, affirmation and negation are equiprimordial. Since each is only intelligible in light of the other, that is saying that something is something and that something is not something, you cannot have one without the other. Descartes has something like this conception, except that he outsources the actual exercising of the two-way power itself to the will. Some might be concerned, perhaps not people here, but some might be concerned that this whole way of thinking about affirmation negation goes against Frege's conception of negation, which has been embedded in post-Freudian logic. But it's not clear that Frege pushes quite as hard on the idea that negation must be absorbed into the judgeable content as he seems to suggest he will need to. Perhaps Frege's greatest insight in this area, expressed in his paper Negation, is that affirmation and negation are not different ways of judging. An instance of this point is that they are not, on the one hand, combining and on the other separating. But Frege makes this point more generally. There is just judging. There are no ways of judging. But even though Frege thinks of himself as pushed into making negation part of the judgeable content, as he says in the paper on negation, his own notation suggests something, I think, less unequivocal. So note that the notation for a negative judgment in the Begriffsschrift involves attaching the negation stroke to the underside of the horizontal content stroke. And I put that on the handout. So the negation stroke is, and I don't know how much this counts for really, but I think worth noting, the negation stroke is still to the left of, and that is outside the judgeable content, A. Even better might have been if Frege had attached the negation stroke not merely to the content stroke, but to the whole complex of judgment and content stroke, and written something like the completely invented notation that I put alongside Frege's on the handout. But in any case, Frege does at least countenance propositional negation not being right inside the judgeable content, I think. So come now to Dieter Henrich and autonomous negation. Henrich has been one of the few to try to spell out just how the negation that's so ubiquitous in Hegel gets into the picture. Henrich identifies what he calls autonomous negation as Hegel's basic operation. His proposal is both salutary and controversial, and it's each of those things, I think, for the same reason, namely, that the proposal tries to provide us with, he says, a key to Hegel's logic, without speaking in Hegelian language. This is both risky and very useful in a certain other way. In Henrich's defense, this is not something like an ignition key that can get the whole logic going somehow while circumventing Hegel's elaborate prescriptions about how we can get the logic underway. But it is nonetheless a key that must be located outside the house, so to speak, which it unlocks if it is to be of any use. It's no good being told that you will find the key inside the house if the house is locked. It may be that I'm going to be talking at cross purposes with Henrich, since Henrich's main interest is the self-referring negativity that comes into its own in the doctrine of essence. And I'm taking myself to be concerned only with something prior to that, namely how Hegel can get negation into the picture in the first place. But maybe it doesn't really matter if Henrich is talking about something else, since what I want to do is cast suspicion on the very first step of his reconstruction of the basic operation in a way that I think leaves a question for what self-referring negativity can possibly be, as well as for my own more basic topic of how to understand negation as Hegel needs it in its most basic form. The locus classicus for Henrich's proposal is his 1973 paper, Hegels Grundoperation, but I think an even clearer exposition is given in his Harvard lectures from the same year, 1973, published as Between Kant and Hegel. And there he says, and this is on the handout, let us take our beginnings with negation alone. In this sense, negation is isolated, and so autonomous negation. Starting only with negation means having nothing but negation. Now, in order to have nothing but negation, we need negation more than once. For in Hegel's view, negation is relational in the sense that there must be something it negates. But inasmuch as there is nothing that negation could possibly negate, owing to the assumption that we have only negation, negation can only negate itself. So you have it on its own, it's relational, so it must relate to something. Well, there's nothing else there, so it must relate to itself, so it must negate itself. Accordingly, autonomous negation can only be a negation of negation. This means that autonomous negation is originally self-referential. In order to have only negation, we have to have negation twice. We come now to a typical Hegelian step. To have negation as self-referring means to have even more than what we have so far said. And I'll break off the quote there. So from here, Henrich goes on to show how Hegelian autonomous negation, he thinks, must turn out to be twice reduplicated double negation. I'll leave this to one side just to focus on the very first step of Henrich's construction. So Henrich says, let us take our beginnings with negation alone, and glosses this by saying that here negation is isolated. So that gets his story about self-referring negation off the ground because, and I think this is really very elegant, there's nothing for negation to negate but itself. But it seems to me that Henrich faces a dilemma here. Perhaps negation does not need anything but itself to go to work on. But then this does not seem anything akin to conventional negation, which negates something. Right? It negates something with some minimal structure. There must be, as it were, something there for it to do its negating work on. Henrich at one point speaks of negation considered in this initial condition as an in itself. But this seems like a fatal bullet to bite. If it's an in itself, like being completely isolated and on its own, it is surely inert, incapable of doing anything. So it would seem, and this is the other horn of the dilemma, negation must here, after all, be something structurally similar enough to conventional negation. And this Henrich seems to rely on when he says, in Hegel's view, negation is relational, in the sense it must be something it negates. But if it is that, if it's sufficiently similar to conventional negation, it can surely not be autonomous and isolated. How is it intelligible to think of negation, then, as not already standing in contrast to something positive or affirmative? It's very difficult to tell how Henrich would answer these questions, or whether they spell any real trouble for the very unusual procedures that he is seeking to reconstruct in Hegel. Taking into account that Henrich's real interest is very difficult passages in at the beginning of the doctrine of essence, where Hegel brings self-referring negation into play. It's very difficult to know what it would be for Hegel's deployment of self-referring negation to pass any kind of test one might set it, because it is by design constantly shape-shifting in its actual manifestation in the logic. It seems it's precisely the negativity that's meant to do much of the work of getting you to see what's going on in the logic in the first place. But one thing that is clear is that Henrich is opposed to parity. That is the parity of affirmation and negation, or of what's captured in blank is blank versus blank is not blank. Henrich says, quote, I think this is also on the handout, the general premises of Hegel's logical theory preclude us from fixing negation together with the rules that govern it, in such a way that we have to see it as correlated from the first with the concept which is its counterpart, for instance, affirmation. So Henrich wants to block equiprimordiality. I think if Henrich is right about this, I'm sorry, I'm presenting you with a sort of massive conditional here, but that's because I just don't know what to say about Hegel's treatment of self-referring negation. If Henrich is right about this, I suggest this raises some serious questions about the intelligibility of Hegel's way of getting negation into the picture. We seem to have lost the idea of negation as stating what is not, in the absence of which it starts to look worryingly indefinite. Okay, so I come now to the short and concluding fourth section, Hegel, negation, and Parmenidean affirmation. So I said that this would be very exploratory, and I'm conscious that the way I've been speaking about what negation must be for Hegel to get it into the picture may be entirely wrong-headed, for quite basic reasons to do with how Hegel understands his philosophical enterprise. I've been suggesting that the opposition between blank is blank and blank is not blank, or the opposition that is manifested or exhibited there, is basic because the contrast it displays, the contrast that's displayed between these kinds of utterance is between what is equiprimordial. You cannot equip yourself with saying what is without also equipping yourself with the ability to say what is not, and vice versa. So in that sense, it's I'm thinking a two-way power. Right? It is one power to be understood, in the understanding of which we see that it is such as to be used in two ways, in two opposing directions. By analogy with Aristotle's comment about medicine or the art of healing, which is a two-way power by which, if I have equipped myself with this power, I am thereby in a position, given the kind of knowledge that exercise of this power involves, I'm in a position thereby to cure and to poison, right, both at once through the very same capacity. Okay, so I've been suggesting that this opposition is basic. And I feel that I feel relatively comfortable in saying that there are good grounds for thinking that. But then it is plausible that Hegel will admit no such basic oppositions. I mean, maybe the very idea of there being such a basic opposition is itself un-Hegelian. Right, that is some primitive opposition from which we must start. For one thing, he appears to have a way of setting affirmation and negation into relation with each other that often sounds like he is thinking of the negative in some sense being the positive and vice versa. So presumably if he thinks that, he can't think that there's a primordial or basic opposition between the two. So he writes in the preface to the first edition of the Science of Logic, quote, the understanding determines and holds the determinations fixed. Reason is negative and dialectical because it resolves the determinations of the understanding into nothing. It is positive because it generates the universal and comprehends the particular therein. But reason in its truth is spirit, which is higher than either merely positive reason or merely intuitive understanding. It is the negative, that which constitutes the quality alike of dialectical reason and of understanding. It negates what is simple, thus positing the specific difference of the understanding. It equally resolves it and is thus dialectical, so this is all about the negative so far, but it does not stay in the nothing of this result, but in the result is no less positive. So I'd be interested to know what people think is the relationship between the negative and the positive in that passage. One way of reading it suggests that the negative is prior and that the positive emerges from the negative. Another possible reading seems to bring them so close together that in some sense, for Hegel, they are one. But it certainly either way seems to count against the idea of there being a basic opposition built into discourse between the negative and the positive. And in the introduction to that work, so to the Science of Logic, he writes, all that is necessary to achieve scientific progress, and it is essential to strive to gain this quite simple insight, is the recognition of the logical principle that the negative is just as much positive. That the negative is just as much positive, or that what is self-contradictory does not resolve itself into a nullity, into abstract nothingness, but essentially only into the negation of its particular content. In other words, that such a negation is not all and every negation, but the negation of a specific subject matter which resolves itself, and consequently is a determinate negation. So furthermore, so to make even more trouble for myself, it's likely that Hegel will want to arrive at any such opposition as that between blank is blank and blank is not blank, if he thinks there is such an opposition, in his usual way, through a complex interplay of mediation and immediacy, from which, judging by his philosophical practice, his notion of negativity seems itself to be inextricable. And negativity seems to work at such a base level, especially in the doctrine of essence, but I think elsewhere as well, that it seems to be that our experience even of negativity is what's supposed to get us the insights he wants us to have about how the logic moves forward. So he'll be needing the negativity even in order to get the opposition between the negative and the positive into the picture. It may also be that Hegel wants to set affirmation and negation in relation to each other in a quite different and even much more complex way. Now, whether that different and complex way might turn out itself to exhibit just what the Eleatic stranger unearths in Sophist is then, in turn, a question of seemingly unmanageable difficulty. And what I have in mind is the following, and this, in a way, gets us back nicely to the consideration of Parmenideanism, both in terms of what I was talking about in the Sophist, but also Bob's distinction between the Parmenidean Hegelians and what I called the authentic Hegelians. So what I have in mind is that the logic begins from a picture of pure affirmation with being pure being. In one sense, as Hegel proceeds, he intends to show this picture to be deficient. He wants us to think that a philosophy of pure affirmation would be deficient. But showing up deficiency for Hegel, here or elsewhere, does not mean exhibiting the impoverishment of something that is, in the light of the discovery of this impoverishment, to be left behind. Instead, it is this showing up of deficiency for Hegel. Instead, it is, when all is said and done, a demonstration of the enrichment that which works to show up this impoverishment at some, let's say, higher stage of the logic provides to that impoverished content. So the impoverishment at the beginning isn't simply left behind. It will turn out to be something other than how it seems in light of that which succeeds. One thing one might think is that the whole trajectory of the logic is that of the power of the negative working in a backwards direction over what it has already dealt with. If that is so, one might raise the question about the very beginning of the logic, whether the pure affirmation found there in the form of being turns out to be equiprimordial with a negation that has done this work. And this is a different question from that of the relationship of being to nothing, which Hegel says are the same and turn into each other. So I do not know. I don't even know how one would set about answering this question, and I don't know if others do on the supposition that it's a well-posed question. I have also left the question of how to understand self-referring negativity completely untouched. But I hope I've indicated something of how deep the problems lie for a reconstruction of what Hegel is up to with negation, relative to what I think we do understand about negation. Thank you.